Chapter 3805. She is now Yimubai's wife. He murmured, in the past, you were very aggressive and good at seducing me. You knew how to make me pay attention to you and how to arouse a man's desire. When Yuan, you've always been such a woman. You're not weak, but now, when Yuan's eyes were calm. What's wrong with me now? She was calm even when she asked this. He felt a little disappointed. He was actually flirting with her just now, but he couldn't see the traces of crazy love in her eyes anymore. Yimubai was a little disappointed. He didn't say anything else. He just smiled and started the car. They didn't speak again until the car drove into the Wen family. The car stopped. Yimubai turned his head and looked at Wen Yuan. I thought you weren't nervous. Her face was a little tense. After a long time, she said, I had a fight with my family, especially my mother. She said, when Yuan raised her head. There was some moisture in the corner of her eyes. She held back her tears for a long time. She said not to step into the Wen family in the future. Yimubai could understand the Wen family's attitude towards her. His brother Yi Mulan's position was very stable now. There was definitely room for development in the future. However, when Yuan let go so easily. In the eyes of the Wen family, even if it was a marriage in name, even if Wen Yuan was like that for the rest of her life, it was worth it. Because the Wen family was a big family and there were too many people who needed to be supported. Yimubai also came from such a family. He naturally knew the powerful connections inside. He reached out and held her hand. Then he said softly and firmly, Wen Yuan, you're still Mrs. Yi. There's no difference. It's just that it's more legitimate. She looked at him and was a little surprised. Yimubai didn't say anything else. He opened the car door and got out first. Then he came to her side and opened the door for her. The moment he opened the door, his voice was very low. Wen Yuan, you're not a weak person. You don't need to be so humble. Even if you use 1% of what you used to seduce me, it's enough. Wen Yuan glanced at him and didn't say anything else. She just got out of the car. Yimubai took the gift from the trunk and walked in with them. Actually, this trip couldn't be considered as pleasing. It was just to tell the Wen clan that Wen Yuan was no longer the wife of the Yi clan's eldest son, but the wife of the Yi clan's second son. Even though it was absurd, Yimubai's status was right there. Everyone had to give face to Yi Mulan. No matter how cold the Wen family was, they wouldn't dare to say anything harsh. He was really indifferent, polite, and very distant. Wen Yuan had already expected this, so she didn't think much about it. She just sat there and experienced her mother's cold treatment. Even when Yimubai gave her a gift, she only smiled reluctantly. Wen Yuan felt a little sad. In the past, when Yi Mulan came here, her parents weren't like this. However, no matter how cold they were, they still ate lunch. It was a worthwhile trip. On the way back, Wen Yuan sat in the front passenger seat in a daze, not saying a word. Yimubai was silent as he drove. He only stopped the car at a red light and spoke softly, Wen Yuan, do you regret it? Ah. She turned her head to look at him. His gaze was calm. Marrying me isn't as glorious as marrying my eldest brother. He knew that although he had good qualifications, marrying Yi Mulan was undoubtedly different. It might be the peak of power. Everyone wanted it. End of this chapter. Chapter 3806. When Yuan looked at him, and there was a hint of surprise in her eyes because she saw something very complicated in his eyes. She couldn't speak for a moment. After a long while, she said bitterly, I don't need glory. He held her hand and after a long while, he said in a hoarse voice, let's do this. What? She turned her face sideways, wanting to ask, but he had no intention of continuing the conversation. She felt bored and stopped talking. She lowered her head and happened to see the ice bracelet on her wrist. She thought that he would give it to her, but when she got home, she returned to the bedroom after taking a shower. Yimubai was leaning against the headboard in his bathrobe. There was only one bedside lamp, and his legs were casually bent. He seemed to be dealing with something on his phone. Her gaze shifted to the side. There was a blue box on the bedside table. Her gaze paused for a few seconds. He also saw her gaze and smiled faintly. He reached out to take the box and opened it. There was a pair of silver rings inside. "Give me your hand." His voice was gentle as he grabbed her hand. Wen Yuan dodged instinctively, but he caught hold of her. He took a glance at her and pulled her towards him. She knelt on the bed in an instant. In front of him, it was as though she was proposing to him. Yimubai glanced at her, and the corners of his mouth seemed to curl up a little. Then, he picked up a slender ring. The ring was made into a very exquisite bamboo joint. It was very beautiful, and Wen Yuan had never seen such a style before. He put it on for her and said faintly, "I designed it." Wen Yuan was a little dazed. She looked at the ring on her finger. It matched the bracelet she had bought previously, making it look very classic. "It suits you." His voice was faint. "If you like gemstones, you can pick another one." In other words, he wasn't interested in those things. He was only responsible for spending money. Wen Yuan wasn't so thick-skinned as to think that he would do anything to her. She shook her head. "I don't like those." Then, a man's ring appeared in her hand. She looked up at him. "Put it on for me," he said. Wen Yuan bit her lower lip. The color of her lips turned lighter and darker, looking a little alluring under the warm yellow light. She reached out and put it on for him, her fingers trembling. After wearing it for a long time, she was still holding his hand. When she came back to her senses, she wanted to let go, but Yimubai pulled her into his arms. She crashed into his firm embrace and looked up. There was a hint of panic in her eyes, and then she was kissed by him. This kiss was different from all the previous ones. It was lingering and gentle. Her fingers were forced to interlock with his and he kissed her from above. At first, it was lingering, and then it became intense. She couldn't stand such an intense kiss. She let out a soft cry and then hugged his waist. Everything was so hot, yet so different. Wen Yuan was in a daze, and he felt as though he was on his wedding night, especially when he held her hand and pressed the rings against each other. The bracelet he gave her was on her slender wrist. They had done it many times, but it had never been as touching as this. He had never been so gentle to her before. Wen Yuan was a little drunk. He had taken her a few times, and after that, he was a little tired. Wen Yuan lay in his arms and panted. Her long black hair was scattered messily on his shoulders. It was quite tempting, and he felt that she was very soft and cute. Chapter 3807. Yimubai couldn't help but reach out to hold a strand of her hair and slowly straighten it out. Although he was a little tired, he didn't really want to sleep. He just wanted to hug her like this. Wen Yuan sensed his rare gentleness. She placed her fingers flat on his chest and tilted her face, looking a little intoxicated. She said softly, "Yimubai. Did we make love or have a baby just now?" Yimubai lowered his head and kissed her forehead. "What do you think?" She lay on her stomach again and didn't say anything. She vaguely felt that he was the one who gave her the ceremony tonight. A pair of rings, and a wedding night. Their relationship wasn't destined to be a public wedding, but he still gave her a small ceremony that belonged to the two of them. Wen Yuan shifted her body and stuck close to him. Her arms changed to hug him, and her face was buried in his neck. She said softly, "Why didn't you do it earlier?" Her voice was a little sobbing, with a hint of reluctance and confusion. Yimubai understood how she felt. He placed his palm gently on her back and gently straightened it. At such a tender moment, she turned her face and blocked his with her hot lips. Her voice trembled. "Yimubai, love me, okay?" At this moment, she felt like she was in a dream. It was like she had returned to the past. She loved him passionately. Regardless of anything. That night, they didn't seem to be tired at all. They did it all the way until the sky was just beginning to brighten. That was probably how the pleasure of fish and water was like. Wen Yuan wasn't the only one who was tired. Yimubai was also a little tired. He slept until noon the next day. When Wen Yuan woke up, she was lying in his arms, and her hair was messy. She had never slept so late before, and she had never lost her composure in front of him. She even drooled on his bathrobe. She lay in his arms, looking like a lost puppy. It was really pitiful. She wanted to explain why she was like that, because she didn't know why she was drooling. It wasn't her style. Bai Shuali was the one who deserved to drool. Wen Yuan brushed her hair, bit her lip and didn't say anything for a long time. Yimubai reached out and gently wiped the saliva off the corner of her mouth. Then, he smiled and said, "Wen Yuan, we missed the private plane." Then, with her saliva on his fingers, he gently stroked her face. Wen Yuan's mind was in a mess. They were probably the first to miss the plane because they had done it the whole night. She was in a daze and didn't even notice that he was lightly stroking her face. Instead, she stuttered, "What about Nan?" "My assistant came over in the morning to take care of him." He had a matter-of-fact expression on his face, but Wen Yuan couldn't treat it as if nothing had happened. She propped herself up and tried to get up, but he reached out and brought her back down again, gently pressing her down to prevent her from moving. His voice was low and husky. "Lie for a while more." His eyes widened, and she of her of him of her of her of his. "So it doesn't matter if we do it one more time." His voice was extremely hoarse. Wen Yuan bit her lip. She wanted to resist, but she couldn't resist him, so she reluctantly gave in. Chapter 3808. Yimubai stared at her for a few seconds, and his thin lips kissed the corner of her mouth. His voice was a little low and hoarse. "But I still want to." Wen Yuan didn't know how other people were like, but she didn't understand. Yimubai used to be so abstinent when he was a movie king. It seemed that his temperament was better than his body, but after she was with him, she felt that he was strong. It was different from what she had imagined. She looked down, and her long eyelashes trembled slightly. Her voice was also a little hoarse. She put her face in his neck and said one word, "It hurts." He looked down at her. She looked so weak and pitiful, so he let her go. He carried her to wash. She was so weak that she couldn't walk on her own. He had to carry her out, and he carried her all the way. Xiangnan was carried by the assistant. He asked in a low voice, "Why does Mommy want Daddy to carry her?" The assistant smiled and coughed lightly. "Because your mother isn't feeling well." The young assistant thought in his heart, "That's because your father is too comfortable, so your mother wants to carry him." Xiangnan didn't have so many thoughts. He had been watching his father carry his mother, and he felt very happy. Children would be happy to see this scene. Yimubai carried Wen Yuan to the airport. The private plane was already waiting for them. It was rescheduled to 3:00 in the afternoon. Other than his assistant, there were also medical staff and all kinds of medical equipment on the private plane. Wen Yuan was placed in a lounge, and so was Xiangnan. At this time, she knew that if it was her, she wouldn't be able to give so much to Xiangnan. Maybe marriage was the right thing to do. She closed her eyes, thinking of the love last night, and felt that it was all worth it. The private plane took off. When they landed at the New York airport, it was evening in New York. The night fell, and there were lights everywhere, like a long line. Xiangnan sat in the limousine and looked outside through the window. It was the first time the little guy went abroad, and everything was new. Yimubai started to deal with things as soon as he got in the car. When Yuan found out that besides being a director, he also opened Universal Pictures and had other investments. In short, he was very rich, or they wouldn't have such a luxurious private plane. More than an hour later, the limousine stopped in front of a very luxurious apartment. The assistant got out and opened the door. Yi Mulin held Xiangnan, and Wen Yuan followed him. He thought about it and let her hold him while he took the luggage. He wasn't a man who liked his assistant and driver to interfere in his life, so only the three of them entered the apartment. It was very big, about 300 square meters. The decorations were also very exquisite. When Yuan realized that the men of the Yi family were very good at enjoying themselves. No matter where they were, they could live like they were at the top. When Yuan, of a good family, but without Yimubai and Yi, she could only live an ordinary person. Of her, of Yi, of Wen Yuan, Luan Yi, of her. She stood there and looked around. On the other hand, Xiangnan was happily walking around, looking here and there. She stood. Of Yi, looked at, of Yi. Yi at. Of Yi. Of Wen Yuan looked at the night view of New York outside the floor-to-ceiling window and whispered, "It's a little too extravagant. Such an apartment would cost tens of millions of dollars." She knew that he could afford it, but she felt uneasy. After all, they were different from others. They weren't a proper married couple. She was afraid that she would get used to living here, and get used to his life. In the blink of an eye, there would be nothing left. Chapter 3809. Their wedding night, 1600 words. Yimubai rested his chin on her shoulder and smiled. "I can afford it." When Yuan bit her lip and didn't say anything. "Are you tired?" he said in a low voice. "I hired a part-time helper who lives nearby. You can call if you need anything, but I asked her not to come when I'm here." When Yuan understood what he meant. He still had to be away from home often in New York. She lowered her eyes and agreed, but her heart was empty. Later, he went to help Xiangnan settle down. She stood where she was and looked down at the ring and bracelet on her hand. She thought to herself that their marriage was different from others. To him, this place didn't matter, and she, Wen Yuan, was just a woman who had a child with him. She smiled awkwardly. On the first night in the New York apartment, Xiangnan was very happy. However, after a long day, he went to sleep after dinner. The room was very cozy, and when Yuan felt that Yimubai had put a lot of effort into it. When they returned to their bedroom, she stood at the door while he took off his sweater. He seemed to be going to shower. She murmured, "Thank you." Yimubai took off the sweater. There was nothing on it. He looked up at her and threw the sweater aside. "What are you thanking me for?" "Wen Yuan, we're husband and wife now. Xiangnan is your son and mine. It's what I should do for him." She froze for a moment before forcing a smile. He looked at her and frowned. "Or do you think we need to be polite like strangers to make you feel more comfortable?" As soon as he said that, he realized that she wanted to avoid this topic. Yimubai's eyes darkened. The problem between them was actually her. She hid in the past and didn't want to come out. She didn't believe that they were an ordinary couple. She seemed to think that they would divorce after they gave birth to the child. To a certain extent, when Yuan was against this marriage, he knew it, but he didn't point it out. In the end, he didn't say anything else and just walked to the bathroom. Go to bed early. You're jet-lagged, or you'll feel terrible tomorrow. He closed the bathroom door and did not invite her to shower with him. Their relationship as husband and wife was not that intimate. Other than wanting her in bed, there was no other place for him. When Yuan walked over slowly and sat down on the sofa. Under the warm yellow light, she looked lost. When Yumubai came out, he saw her expression. He had a towel wrapped around his waist and was drying his hair with one hand. Standing in front of her, he said calmly, "Go take a shower." There was a hint of command in his voice. When Yuan looked up and stared into his eyes. Pinching her chin, Yumubai lowered his head and pressed his lips against hers. He stared at her and said slowly, "Haven't you always wanted to marry me? Do you regret it now, or do you feel that it's different from what you imagined?" She shook her head and her throat moved. "It's just unreal." He nibbled on her lips and immediately let go of her. He turned his back on her and continued to dry his hair. His body was very good, slender and strong. His back was bulging with just the right amount of muscles. She remembered how explosive his body was, when Yuan was stunned. Suddenly, the towel in his hand fell on her head and she pulled it off. Yumubai leaned on the sofa opposite her and smiled. "When Yuan, do you know what you look like now? You look like a child who has always wanted to eat a piece of meat, but when she eats it, she doesn't think it's delicious. She wants to vomit but can't." When Yuan glared at him. "There's another way." There was a hint of mockery in his tone. "If it doesn't work, you can just digest it and take it out." After saying that, he didn't care about her anymore and directly lifted the quilt to lie down. After lying flat, he said, "Come over in half an hour. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that I won't do it to you tonight. If you can't get pregnant, don't cry when your son suffers." He said it ruthlessly and cruelly without any emotion. When Yuan was so angry that she threw the towel in her hand at his face. Yumubai pulled it away and sneered. "I thought you didn't have a temper anymore." When Yuan walked straight into the bathroom and closed the door with a bang. Yimubai's originally angry face suddenly broke into a smile. In fact, Xiangnan was her weakness. He was stubborn. Whenever her baby son was mentioned, she would lose her temper. Yumubai lay down and thought of the previous Wen Yuan. She was scheming and shameless. She dared to throw herself on him, drugged him, and forced him to drink. It was also the first time he hugged a woman he didn't want to hug. However, he didn't expect her body to be so soft. He got addicted to hugging her. However, he didn't like her because he didn't like scheming women. Now that she had given birth to a child, she was as dumb as an idiot. He really didn't know if all her IQ had been passed on to Xiangnan. Now, apart from her appearance, she had nothing else, but she was a little more interesting in bed. He suddenly thought of how she hugged and kissed him last night. Her voice trembled as she asked him to love her. Just thinking about it made his blood boil. He snorted. She only had the ability to seduce him. She really didn't make any progress in other aspects. However, he knew very well that with Wen Yuan's looks, she really didn't need to know anything to make many men like her. However, when she was young, how could she only like him and only like him? She liked him secretly, unlike Shirley who followed behind him all day long. It was true that he didn't like her because she didn't have a son. However, now that she was a little stupid, he was more pleasing to the eye. I'll update tomorrow at noon, end of this chapter. Chapter 38:10. Yimubai's body was a little hot from thinking about it. He sat up and wanted to smoke a cigarette, but he gave up when he remembered that they were preparing for pregnancy. He picked up a magazine and read it casually. When Yuan came back, she was a little surprised to see that he wasn't asleep. She adjusted her pajamas and slowly lay down beside him. Her body was a little stiff. Yimubai turned his head to look at her and suddenly pulled her into his arms. She stiffened even more. He hugged her tightly and said in a low voice with a hint of temptation, "If you keep stiffening like this, I'll make you soft. Do you believe it or not?" When Yuan didn't say anything else and just turned her back on him. He hugged her waist from behind. He was very tall, and her 165 centimeters height seemed especially petite in his arms. His thin lips were next to her ear, and his voice was also low and husky. "I won't touch you today. Sleep." When Yuan didn't move but just bit her lip. He leaned against her and smiled. "Wasn't it good before? That night in B City, why, are you regretting it?" As he said that, his warm palm gently stroked her lower abdomen. "It might or might not be pregnant with their child. In 2 days, we'll do it again and we'll have a child." He smiled and nibbled on her earlobe. She relaxed and fell from his arms. Their fingers were tightly intertwined. He lowered his head and asked softly, "Do you regret it?" "No," she said randomly and turned her head. "Don't ask." He clasped her hand and leaned forward to the corner of her mouth, pecking her again and again. "Why don't you ask? Don't you like doing it with me?" As he said that, he smiled softly. "When Yuan, you clearly like it. I don't." She turned her head away, not wanting to look at him or pay attention to him. But his lips quickly found her and kissed her passionately before she could react. It was a hungry kiss and a powerful exploration. Then he retracted his hand and resumed intertwining their fingers, letting her feel. He chuckled. "Your body doesn't express it like this." She resisted, but she couldn't resist. How could the two young bodies not desire each other? After all, they were both young and vigorous, and they were very compatible. They both had memories of each other's bodies. When Yuan was a little ashamed. He rubbed his face on the pillow and said in a hoarse voice, "Don't say it." He laughed and held her with one hand. The other hand that he used just now brushed across her face. "Why don't you say it? Isn't that how a couple should be?" When Yuan was in a daze for a moment. "Married couple," Imubai's fingers gently stroked her red lips, and his voice became hoarser, "Something's not right. We are husband and wife. When Yuan, it seems that you haven't completed the change of identity." That night, she was clearly fine, but today, something was wrong again. Yimubai used to be impatient with Wen Yuan, but it was different now. She was a little cute, so he would coax her. Wen Yuan lowered her eyes and bit his finger subconsciously. Then her eyes widened. He couldn't believe it, but he was also a little angry. Yimubai chuckled and leaned over to nibble her ear. "Does it taste good?" She wanted to get up to brush her teeth. He was too evil and too hateful. Yimubai pressed her down and didn't let the knife get up. Wen Yuan was a little angry. "Yimubai, you bastard." She was so angry that she was about to cry, but he still pressed her down. This book is from Chapter 38:11. He looked at her as if his eyes were on fire. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her deeply. He tasted her so deeply that it seemed to reach the depths of her soul. Then, he pressed her down and kissed her, until Wen Yuan felt that it was inappropriate. She pulled his hair. "Yimubai, don't, I don't think you're dirty," he said in a low voice. Then, he got what he wanted. After a long time, he kissed her. Wen Yuan resisted, but there was nowhere to escape. She had never felt this kind of intense trembling in the depths of her soul. Moreover, that kind of reckless madness made her feel scared. She had never seen him like this before. When they did that kind of thing, he restrained himself as if there was a layer between them. But now, he really didn't think it was dirty. Even when Yuan didn't like it. Yi Mubai went to the washroom. When he came back, he was refreshed. He hugged her and lay down, but his voice was hoarse. Sleep. When Yuan lay in his arms. After a long time, she said, "We can't do it. Why do you make yourself so uncomfortable?" He opened his eyes and looked at her. Then, he closed his eyes and sighed. This is the fun between a husband and wife. When you seduced me, didn't you know what men like? Now you're pretending again. She closed her eyes and seemed to want to sleep. But when Yi Mubai was about to fall asleep, she suddenly reached out and pinched him. Yi Mubai woke up at once. He opened his eyes and stared at her. When Yuan smiled innocently. I won't pretend anymore. Her fingers were still rubbing him. It was not rubbing. It was obviously flirting and seducing. Yi Mubai reached out and grabbed her hand. His eyes were dangerous. Mrs. Yi, if you go on like this, I can't guarantee that I won't care. Sleep. She put her hands around his waist and put her face on his heart. His heart was beating strongly. When Yuan thought that Yi Mubai was also an ordinary man. He could also breathe, eat and sleep. He was actually the same as others. When Yuan closed her eyes. Yi Mubai lowered her head to look at her, then chuckled softly. They had a good night's sleep. The next day, they took Xiangnan for a checkup. Xiangnan's condition was under control, and Wen Yuan was slightly relieved. Back at the apartment, Yi Mubai ate with him and said that he was going away for 2 days, probably to Los Angeles. When Yuan was eating, he put down his chopsticks and asked softly, "Are you going to film or attend a film festival?" "It's a publicity stunt," Yi Mubai said frankly, "and you'll meet Lin Danny, but it won't be anything." He shook her hand as a promise to her. When Yuan nodded and did not say anything. He said again, "Xiangnan needs to be taken care of. Why don't you come with me?" "I understand, I don't care about that." She gave him a faint smile. Yi Mubai kept holding her hand and coughed. "I'll be back the night after tomorrow. It might be a little late, but I'll definitely be back. Wait for me." She was a little surprised. He said again, "Take care of Xiangnan, okay?" As he spoke, he got up and hugged Xiangnan. He kissed him and said reluctantly, "Listen to your mom, okay?" Xiangnan grunted and obediently kissed him back on the cheek. He smiled and kissed him again. When he put down Xiangnan, he leaned over and kissed the child's mother. "Don't go out these 2 days. Auntie will come over to cook every day. Call me if you need anything, okay?" This book came from Chapter 38:12. When Yuan nodded. He had to go. When he left, he was a little reluctant. After Yi Mubai left, When Yuan took a good look at the apartment with Xiangnan. Because there were people to do the housework, When Yuan had nothing to do. She took Xiangnan to look around the apartment. This apartment was probably designed by a designer. It was very tasteful, but When Yuan didn't particularly like curtains. He felt that it was too boring. The auntie at home had lived in this area for more than 10 years. When Yuan asked her where she could order curtains, and the auntie told her. So on the first day, When Yuan went to the market and brought Xiangnan to pick out the cloth she liked. Xiangnan's room was chosen by him. It took them a day to finally change the curtains in the apartment. The auntie said that it was beautiful. She said that the original ones were also very beautiful, but now it looked more like a place where people lived. Wen Yuan smiled and took Xiangnan under the setting sun. They each took a book and sat on a cushion in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. The setting sun shone on them, forming a faint halo. After a long time, Xiangnan looked up at Wen Yuan. "Mommy, when will Daddy be back?" Wen Yuan thought for a moment. "He'll be back tomorrow night, but it'll be very late." "Xiangnan, sleep early. You can see Daddy early the next morning." Xiangnan said, "Oh." Then, he threw himself into Wen Yuan's arms and said softly, "Mommy, I like New York." Because there was Daddy and Mommy in New York, they didn't quarrel. Wen Yuan hugged the little boy and looked down at Xiangnan. In fact, Xiangnan rarely acted like this. He must be very happy. Xiangnan blushed and asked, "Mommy, do you like New York?" Wen Yuan smiled faintly. "You like it, right? Because Xiangnan, Daddy, and a little sister are here, right?" Xiangnan's voice was very innocent. Wen Yuan smiled and kissed his son gently. "Maybe it's a little brother. I like them all." Xiangnan was a little excited. "I heard Anthan say that children look like little toys." Wen Yuan laughed. "Children grow up very quickly." She looked at Xiangnan and smiled. "When you were born, you also looked like a little toy." Xiangnan's little face turned red, and he threw himself into his mother's arms. After a while, he said, "I take care of the baby, I don't treat him as a toy." When Yuan's heart softened, an indescribable feeling, Yimubai was not around, so she took care of Xiangnan. Life here was very good, and everything was well arranged. In addition to the auntie, he also had an assistant in New York called Su Mo, who was also from B City. Su Mo would come by every day. He could be considered as auntie's direct superior, and he was very meticulous in his management. The auntie complained to Wen Yuan, "Miss Su treats me like an artist manager and expects me to become popular. She works very hard." Wen Yuan smiled. "Don't mind her. She's probably used to it." The auntie was very dedicated to her work, but she couldn't get used to this kind of management. Wen Yuan later talked to Su Mo once. She was a girl who was only about 155 centimeters tall. She had a small body and a lot of energy. The auntie whispered, "She used to manage many big stars in the past, and all the big stars in the country were managed by her. She's very capable." Wen Yuan just smiled. Actually, she didn't care much about Su Mo's ability, because the auntie worked in the apartment. As the hostess, she didn't want anyone to interfere, even if it was Yimubai's assistant. This book came from Chapter 38:13. Do you miss me? For so, while Su Mo was still managing the auntie at home, she still called Yimubai. Yimubai picked up the phone. He seemed to be in a public place, so he said calmly to wait for a while. After about a minute, he became quiet. Yimubai leaned against the aisle, holding the phone in his hand. He looked warm. "Why did you call? Do you miss me?" When Yuan was silent for a while before saying, "Can you not let Su Mo get involved in our family matters?" Yimubai held a cigarette between his slender fingers. He didn't smoke it, but just played with it between his fingers. After a while, he smiled. "Are you unhappy?" "I like the quiet." She sounded a little unhappy. "Besides, Auntie is not her artist. Your assistant doesn't need to report to me every day." Yimubai smiled. "Are you unhappy because she is a young and unmarried girl?" "I'm not." When Yuan tried to reason with him. "Yimubai, that's where I live. I don't want anyone else, you just care about other women appearing, don't you?" he said lazily. When Yuan's eyes widened and he suddenly asked, "You did it on purpose, didn't you?" Yimubai smiled and didn't deny it. When Yuan was furious and hung up the phone. Yimubai looked at the phone, smiled again, and called her. When Yuan didn't pick up, so he continued to call until she picked up. "Yi Mulin, what's up?" she asked in a reserved manner. Yimubai smiled. "I'll be back tonight." "Whatever," she said in a bad tone and then hung up the phone again. Yimubai looked at the phone, thinking that she was really angry. He thought for a while and called Su Mo. "You don't have to go to the apartment tomorrow." Su Mo breathed a sigh of relief in New York. "Thank you, Director Yi. I really can't do this job anymore." Yimubai smiled. "Is Wen Yuan not easy to get along with?" Su Mo complained. "He's easy to get along with, but it makes me feel uneasy when he's too easy to get along with." As a result, he complained to the boss. Yimubai said lightly, "No woman would like another woman to appear at home." Su Mo gnashed his teeth, "Then why did Night Guide send me?" Yimubai smiled. "I'm not going anymore, am I? Then I shall thank you, one night, one director." Su Mo gnashed his teeth in anger. This was the first time he had hung up on his boss's call. What the fuck? This seemingly decent man actually had such a bad taste. In New York, when Yuan hung up the phone, the auntie at home looked at him eagerly. Did Sir agree? When Yuan also looked at her. After a long time, he slowly said, "I think he agreed." The auntie clapped her hands. "Like I said, this is not a company, and we are not actors. Sir, you are too ridiculous." As she spoke, she looked at Wen Yuan cautiously. "Madam, I didn't mean it that way. I was just spouting nonsense." She was worried that Wen Yuan would be angry, so she kept apologizing. Wen Yuan didn't really care. "I'll bring it up when he comes back. Don't worry, auntie. If you don't feel comfortable, I won't feel comfortable either." As she walked, she said, "I am Yimubai's wife, not his artist. Why do I need a manager?" The auntie said yes repeatedly. When Yuan walked back to the bedroom and frowned slightly. Then he let out a long sigh. She thought that her marriage with Yimubai was dull, but he obviously didn't think so. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:14. At night, the auntie also went back. She and Xiangnan watched TV together. It was originally a children's program, but then Xiangnan took the remote control and said he wanted to see his father, so when Yuan looked at him, Xiangnan smiled and quickly changed the channel to a certain award ceremony. He timed it very well, and it happened to be when Yimubai went on stage to receive an award. The person who was with him was none other than Lin Danny. When Yuan pursed his lips and stared at the person on the screen without blinking. After Yimubai received the award, he stood side by side with Lin Danny for a photo. There was quite a distance between them. When Yuan watched quietly, watching him give his acceptance speech. On the screen, Yimubai was wearing a classic black suit with a white shirt inside, looking very elegant. He was born into a good family and looked good. Even when he stood in front of many Western men, he was still dazzling. Yimubai stood in front of the microphone and spoke in English in a soft but firm voice. "Thank you to the jury for giving me this award. Here, I would like to thank everyone in the crew for their efforts, thank the audience, and also thank my wife, In." He looked at the camera and showed an extremely charming smile. This was also the first time Yimubai showed such a charming smile in front of the camera since he retired from acting. It was for his wife, and beside him was Lin Danny, who had been rumored to be in a relationship with him. The live broadcast immediately gave her a specific shot, and the fans off-screen also felt extremely sorry for their idol. Even though Lin Danny's acting was good, at this moment, it was extremely unnatural. She smiled very reluctantly and then glanced at Yimubei, but Yimubei didn't return her gaze. After Yimubei finished speaking, it was Lin Danny's turn. Compared to Yimubei, she was a little incoherent and was still affected. In the end, she didn't even know what she was saying. Don't get off the stage. She was also sitting with Yimubei. After sitting down, she looked at the camera and whispered, "You did it on purpose, didn't you? Did you do it for me to see?" "No, it's for when you on." Yimubei was still smiling. She must be watching in front of the TV. Lin Danny tilted her head and looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief. After a long time, she said softly, "You won't like her." Yimubei tilted his head and smiled faintly. "I like it." Lin Danny's expression froze. The camera caught it and zoomed in. These awards were also very gossipy. Of course, Wen Yuan, who was sitting in front of the TV, saw it too. Xiangnan looked at her worriedly and gently held her hand with his small hand. "Mom." Wen Yuan knew that he had scared him. He reached out to turn off the TV and smiled. "What's wrong, Xiangnan?" Xiangnan carefully looked at her expression and then said carefully, "Mom, aren't you angry?" "There's nothing to be angry about. Dad didn't do anything." When Yuan reached out to touch his head and whispered, "Okay, go to sleep." Xiangnan responded with an "oh" and obediently went to brush his teeth and wash his face. Then, he obediently lay on his own bed. He looked at his mother tenderly. When Yuan sat by the bed and told him a story. After a while, Xiangnan fell asleep, his little face very calm. When Yuan placed his palm flat on his little head and looked at him for a long time before returning to the room. She didn't think about him and Lin Danny in the same frame. He had said before that she didn't mind. This book is from Chapter 38:15. However, the way Lin Danny looked at him still made him a little uncomfortable. When Yuan sat quietly for a while before returning to his room. His phone was on the bedside table. There was a WeChat message from Yimubei. "I'll be back in 2 hours." Just these few words. When Yuan bit his lip and did not reply to his message. He tossed his phone aside and went to the bathroom. After washing up, he lay back on the bed and looked at the time. It was already 11 o'clock. She wasn't going to wait for him. When Yuan lay down and covered his face with his hands, then closed his eyes. He didn't want to think about him, and he didn't want to think about the things between him and Lin Danny. It was pretty boring. When Yimubei returned, it was almost 1 o'clock at night. He gently closed the door and put down his luggage. He first went to see Xiangnan, kissed him, and then went to the master bedroom. When Yuan fell asleep. But she left the bedside lamp on. Yimubei looked at her quietly at the door. After a while, he slowly took off his tie and coat and put them on the sofa in the bedroom. He kicked off his leather shoes and walked to the bed to sit down. The soft bed sunk in. He held her face with one hand and placed the other on her shoulder to prevent her from escaping. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her, when Yuan naturally woke up. He opened his eyes and met his dark eyes. He twisted his head and smiled, deepening the kiss. When Yuan had no choice but to grab his hand and try to break free. But instead, his hand was pinned to the bed, their fingers interlocked, and he kissed her even more deeply. When Yuan struggled for a while more, but he simply softened his body and let him kiss him. His kiss was slow and steady, as if he had a lifetime to do this. When he was satisfied, he still held her fingers and asked softly, "Did you miss me?" When Yuan's body softened from the kiss. He turned his head away and said, "No. Liar." He chuckled. "Do you want me to check?" As he said this, he was really going to make a move. She remembered that his fingers were so evil a few days ago. She was so scared that she grabbed his hand and didn't let him touch her. Yimubai kissed the corner of her mouth. "Tell me the truth, and I'll let you go." She looked away. "I'm not thinking about it." He was about to hit her again when she hurriedly stopped him. She then said softly, "You were the one who said you would let me go if you told me the truth." He was no longer in a hurry. He simply lay down beside her and gently pulled her into his arms. It was obviously very cold outside, so he should be very cold when he came back from outside. However, after taking off his jacket, his body was very warm. She didn't feel any coldness from his body when she came out of the bed. Yimubai lowered his head. His face was very close to hers. His voice was low and husky. In such a late night, it sounded a little seductive. "Do you miss me or are you angry?" She just looked at him. He smiled. "Are you angry?" As he spoke, he hooked his fingers around hers. "There's nothing going on between us. We just received an award together. I didn't even attend the celebration party before coming back to accompany you. How can you be unhappy?" He nibbled on her nose. "You don't even look happy. When you weren't like this before." When Yuan looked at him and smiled faintly. "How was I before?" "You were quite attached to me, Anne." His voice became a little low again. "You were very obsessed with my body and wouldn't let go of any opportunity to seduce me." He pressed his forehead against hers, and his voice became a little hoarse. "When Yuan, is my body not attractive to you now?" This book came from Chapter 38:16. When Yuan's face heated up and she looked away. "Yimubai, I want to sleep." He chuckled. "Are you going to sleep, or are you going to sleep with me?" She glared at him. "I'm going to sleep." She broke away and crawled under his arms, wearing only a white nightgown. He stared at her. When she crawled over, the nightgown stuck to her body, revealing her slender waist. It was especially beautiful. He felt that he could hold her waist with one hand. His eyes were a little fiery. She was clearly a woman who had given birth to a child. Why was her waist still so slender and soft? There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. He gazed at her and said in a low voice, "You're going to sleep like this. You're not going to care about me anymore, okay?" As he said that, he lifted the blanket and crawled under it, turning off the lights. When Yuan fell into his arms and bit her lip. "Yimubai," his voice continued to be hoarse. "We agreed, okay?" She thought he was going to say that he was going to give birth to a child, but he bit the tip of her nose that was dripping with sweat. His voice became even lower. "I told you to wait for me. I'm going to sleep by myself, okay?" As he spoke, he gently pulled out her pajamas from under the blanket. When Yuan was no match for him, and in the end, she could only curl up in his arms. His clothes were neat and tidy, without a shirt, trousers, and belt. She felt a little strange in his arms, and she also felt especially fragile. "Why aren't you saying anything?" he said a little harshly. When Yuan bit her lip and closed her eyes gently. "Say what?" He chuckled, his large palms moving very slowly. He kissed her every now and then until she couldn't take it anymore and cried out. She called his name, Yimubai. He asked gently, still unhurriedly. He hooked his arm under her chin and kissed her, from her cheek to her chin. When he was in the mood, he bit her chin so hard that she wanted to cry, but she couldn't. She leaned into his arms and cried out his name. Yimubai's voice was a little hoarse. Beg me. She was unwilling and turned her head away. He forced her even more. Beg me to take you, okay? When Yuan couldn't take it anymore. She bit his shoulder lightly and said in a soft voice, Yimubai, you bastard. He knew that he couldn't tease her anymore. He chuckled and grabbed her hand to his belt. Open it. The light was very dim and her expression was especially gentle and a little shy. He held her hand and said, You're already a mother, and you're still so shy. She used to be very bold, but when he took the initiative, she wasn't like before. Yi, he said in a low voice. She kept her head down, and he forced her to look up. Then, he carried her on top of his body. All kinds of coercion were infuriating. After a few rounds of indulgence, he carried her to the bathroom. In the warm water of the bathtub, he couldn't help but take her again. After this time, not to mention her, even he was almost done. He washed up and returned to the bed. He was still pressing against her, and his voice was like a spring breeze. Do you think we did it for nothing just now? It's all washed away, when Yuan was very tired. She closed her eyes and said, Yimubai, I don't have the energy to accompany you anymore. He observed her for a while and realized that she was really exhausted by him. He chuckled and lay beside her. He looked at the ceiling for a while and then turned his head. If you don't wait for me in the future, I'll do this to you again. He was actually a little excited. When Yuan's eyes were still closed as if she hadn't heard anything. After about half a minute, she opened her eyes. Her gaze was a little complicated. You're in love, Yimubai laughed. Your reflexes are really long. He leaned against the headboard. He was wearing a white bathrobe, which showed off his young and sturdy figure. A man like him was successful and famous. Naturally, there were many women who liked him. When Yuan used to be attracted to him because of his looks. Of the two Yi brothers, Yi Mulin didn't look any worse than Yimubai. However, Yi Mulin gave off a more professional vibe. People would usually be scared off by his cold aura. However, Yimubai was different. All the women who saw him had only one thought, he was very good-looking and they wanted to sleep with him. It was probably because Yi Mulin had Yi Xinggang's aura, while Yimubai had inherited more of Su Fu's aura. At this moment, he was stroking her hair with one hand and rubbing the headboard with the other. It was obvious that he wanted to have an after-sex cigarette. However, he thought of Wen Yuan and gave up. He continued rubbing her hair and kissed her. One more time, Wen Yuan thought that he was a pervert. She turned her back and ignored him. He smiled and slid down. He hugged her from behind and prepared to sleep. However, his hands were not honest. As he touched her, he said softly, Why is your waist still so thin? You've already given birth to a child. You like it thicker. She wanted to sleep. She rubbed her head on the pillow and said gently, Then I'll get fatter. He hugged her from behind. His fingers gently stroked her hair, and his other hand was still holding her slender waist. He was reluctant to let go. When Yuan really wanted to sleep. His breathing was weak. I don't have the energy to accompany you anymore. If you still want to, you can either solve it yourself or find someone else. She had just finished speaking when she felt a bite on her shoulder. When Yuan cried out in pain. Are you going to say it or not? His voice was low. If you say it again, I'll kill you. Chapter 38:17. When Yuan's shoulder was in pain, but after being bitten like this, he sobered up a little. She gently blinked her eyes for a long time before saying, I'm telling the truth. No. He moved closer to her and his face was close to hers. He placed a warm palm on her lower abdomen. You don't think so, Wen Yuan? You are obviously a big vinegar jar. He looked like he wouldn't let her go if she didn't admit it or take back her words. He bit the back of her ear and said, "Say what you just said again." "I want to sleep." When Yuan turned around in his arms and hugged his body. He stared blankly for a moment, then chuckled softly. He placed her hand on his waist and lowered his head to kiss her. "Say something nice and I'll let you go, HM." When Yuan couldn't take it anymore. He bit his lips and buried his face in his chest. She didn't speak, but she was very soft. Yimubai lowered his head and kissed her hair. "All right, I'll let you go." She uttered a muffled sound and fell asleep in his arms. She was indeed very tired. Yimubai was a normal man. He hadn't had a woman for a long time, and they were newlyweds. He wanted her to be hot that night, almost to the limit of his endurance. However, he allowed her to fall asleep from exhaustion. At this moment, he was a little tempted. In fact, it was not that he had never had a woman before, and it was not that he had never done it with her. However, he had a strong interest in her now. Yimubai lay flat and looked at the woman in his arms. He thought about a set of data that he had seen before. No matter how beautiful a woman was, she wouldn't have much interest after doing it once. He and Wen Yuan actually had more than that, but he still wanted her. He reached out and gently pinched her face. He said softly, "I don't know what kind of aphrodisiac you used." He was not a promiscuous man, but now he wanted to come every night. Of course, he could not. They had to have a child now. Thinking that when Yuan was pregnant for 10 months and would probably be a few months away from giving birth, he lay down and sighed softly. The next morning, when Yuan woke up and realized that he was lying in his arms. He was stunned for a moment before he slowly raised his eyes. He was awake. His smooth chin was slightly green, and it looked very nice under the sunlight. When Yuan quickly closed his eyes and pretended not to wake up. Still pretending. A warm voice sounded beside her ear, and then she was pressed onto the soft bed. He kissed her deeply, and then he felt that it was not enough, so he dragged her up into his arms and kissed her. In the morning light, she sat on his lap, feeling a little helpless as he kissed and rubbed her. Her entire body was sore, and she could only let him hug her. He kissed her for a long time, panting with his chin on her shoulder. When he calmed down, he chuckled. "I'm going to the bathroom." After that, he let go of her and walked straight to the bathroom. When Yuan laid down and let out a long sigh. He was really a beast. Yimubai's voice rang out in the bathroom. "You can sleep for a while. Auntie will come and take Xiangnan." When Yuan closed her eyes and listened to the sound of water in the bathroom. After a while, she heard him come out. She thought that he would get up. After all, he had taken a shower, but she didn't expect him to come out with a bath towel around him and then lie on the bed again. When Yuan closed her eyes. "Yimubai, don't you have anything to do?" Chapter 38:18. When Yuan closed his eyes. "Yimubai, don't you have anything to do?" "I want to make love. There's nothing else to do today." He smiled and reached out to caress her belly. "These 2 days are our last chance. Why don't we work harder?" He was joking with her, and when Yuan did not take it seriously. She felt that he had purposely made her pregnant last night, and it was almost all in the traditional position of Z. If she still didn't get pregnant, she would think that there was something wrong with them. She didn't say anything. He could tell that she was under a lot of pressure, so he rubbed her head and said, "You'll get pregnant. I have a hunch." When Yuan looked at him and smiled faintly. It was a little warm and gentle. Yimubai's gaze also fell on her face. After a long time, he gently kissed her. This kiss was a little different from before. Wen Yuan was a little startled. Are you silly? He hugged her and leaned against the headboard. Then, he looked at the French window opposite them and the changed curtains. Wen Yuan also looked at him. She wasn't sure if he liked this style, and she didn't know if he would be angry that she changed her original style. Yi Mubai lowered his head. It's pretty. He reached out and patted her head. You can change it anywhere you want. As he spoke, he seemed to think of something. He took out a card from the drawer on the side and put it in her hand. This is my secondary card. If you want to buy anything, you can withdraw it or swipe it. The password is Xiangnan's birthday. Wen Yuan wanted to reject, but Yi Mubai's voice rang out faintly. Wen Yuan, we're husband and wife now. You don't have to be so distant with me. Is there a problem with a man raising a family? Wen Yuan lowered his head and said nothing. Yi Mubai gently held her in his arms and coughed, or do you think it's better for me to sleep with you for free? She stared at him with wide eyes. Sleep with me and pay for my services. He rubbed his chin, sounds good. Wen Yuan bit his lip. Yi Mubai, can you not do this? All the joking in his eyes disappeared, and he looked at her seriously. Wen Yuan's voice was very soft. You're not like this. Then what kind of man am I? He hugged her easily. Isn't it normal to give your wife money to spend? Also, it's normal for me to have sex with my wife, unless you want me to spread out. In the past, I could control myself because I didn't have a wife. Now, there's no reason for me to be abstinent, right? Wen Yuan looked at him, his voice even lighter and more airy. I always thought that we should keep some distance. Wen Yuan, you're the one who thinks this way, but I've never thought this way. There isn't a husband in the world who thinks this way. As a husband and wife, we need to keep our distance. Where did you learn this from? Did you learn it from your marriage with Yi Mulin? He held her chin and whispered, You've kissed and hugged him in front of me, do you feel anything? Wen Yuan was dumbfounded. Was he going to interrogate her? She stared blankly and shook her head slowly. No. He chuckled softly. It's good that you don't. I believe that you don't either. Wen Yuan was still looking at him. After a long time, he asked softly, Do you mind? He grunted, his eyes never leaving her. Wen Yuan licked his lips and looked away. At that time, I thought you were gone. She thought about it, a little sad, and laughed at herself. Wen Yuan. He called her name. Basically, I'm a very pragmatic man. If I like you, I like you. If I don't like you, I don't like you. I won't lie to you and say that I liked you in the past, but I like you now. She was stunned again. He said, like. She stared straight at him, looking a little silly and stupid. Jiutian Shenhuang. Chapter 38:19. Chapter 38:19, Pregnancy. When Yuan woke up again, it was already afternoon. The sun shone on the soft bed. When she woke up, her entire body was sore and limp. It was an indescribable feeling. She opened her eyes and looked around. It was a little dazzling, so she covered her eyes with her hands. Lying down, her body was limp and she didn't want to move. Then, she buried her face in the pillow again. There was Yi Mubai's scent in the pillow. It was a very unique scent. When Yuan buried her face. Suddenly, she remembered what happened last night and this morning. Her face was a little red, so she kept burying her face. At this moment, the door opened and a little person ran in. She threw herself on the bed and pulled the blanket. Mummy. The next second, the little fellow was stunned. Because Mummy wasn't wearing any clothes. The little fellow stared at her blankly for a long time. Then, she whispered to Yimubai behind her, "Will Mummy catch a cold if she doesn't wear clothes?" Yimubai followed behind and immediately covered Wen Yuan with the blanket. Then, he carried the little fellow and placed him on the sofa. He hugged her with the blanket. "Do you remember?" Wen Yuan's face was a little red. "Bring Xiangnan out." Xiangnan was still thinking about the previous question. "Won't Mummy feel cold if she doesn't wear clothes?" Yimubai looked at his son and said seriously, "Daddy will keep Mummy warm. In the future, you will keep your wife warm too." Xiangnan suddenly felt embarrassed. His little face was red. "Can I keep Baianan warm?" Yimubai and Wen Yuan were stunned. Then, as the father, he was about to go berserk. He shouted at Yi Xiangnan, "That's your sister." Xiangnan shrugged, feeling that it was quite a pity. After all, he thought that Baianan's little body was quite cute. He had secretly taken a look. She had a big head and a small body. She was super cute. Yi Xiangnan looked at his loving parents and felt that he was a little extra, so he ran out quietly. At this time, Yimubai pushed aside the quilt and looked at the little girl in his arms. He said in a low voice, "Are you tired?" Wen Yuan let him hug him and rested his chin on his shoulder. After a long time, he finally said, "It hurts a little." Yimubai was taken aback for a moment before he reached his hand under the blanket. Wen Yuan shrieked, "Yimubai, what are you doing? Does it hurt?" He lowered his eyes to stare at her face. Under his gaze, Wen Yuan's face turned red. Unable to speak for a long time, she could only bury her face in his chest. His fingertips were gentle as he massaged her. She was in his arms, and they had never experienced such intense affection before, just like every other pair of newlyweds. The only difference was that they already had a very big child. At this moment, it was so hot. After a long time, he asked her with a hoarse voice, "Are you feeling better?" Wen Yuan didn't say anything and just hugged him. He was a mature man who understood women, especially her body. He leaned against her ear and asked in a low voice, "Are you feeling better?" Wen Yuan bit his lip and didn't say anything for a long time. He chuckled and continued to massage her for a while. He only let go when both of them couldn't take it anymore. After coaxing her for a long time, he finally helped her put on a set of home clothes. When he was about to leave, Wen Yuan pulled his hand. "Yimubai, will we have children?" He turned around and smiled. "We will. Don't worry." In fact, Xiangnan's condition was under control. Even if they couldn't get pregnant this month, they could delay it for another 2 months. There would be no problem at all. Moreover, he had a feeling that she was already pregnant with his child. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:20. Chapter 38:20, Pregnancy this time, he hoped that it would be a girl, like Baianan. Wen Yuan pursed her lips. Yimubai scratched her face. "I'll heat up the food for you. Come out after you brush your teeth and wash your face." She wasn't used to this. Perhaps it was because she had maintained a cold relationship with him for too long. She looked at him in a daze and said softly, "Yimubai." He nodded and looked at her. "Actually, you don't have to be so nice to me. Just be the same as before," she said uncomfortably. He smiled and stretched out his hand to gently touch her soft and tender face. However, he did not say anything and directly walked out. Wen Yuan's face was a little hot. She didn't say anything and immediately went to brush her teeth and wash her face. However, her heart was still beating very fast. She thought to herself that it had been so long. How could she be so easily seduced by him again, when Yuan went out after brushing her teeth and washing her face. Yimubai had already prepared the food. It was 4 delicious dishes and 1 soup. She saw that he hadn't touched it, so she looked at him. Xiangnan made it. I haven't eaten yet. He smiled faintly and sat down with her. Auntie, I asked her to go back. When Yuan nodded. She felt a little uncomfortable sitting with him. Don't you want to ask me about what happened last night? Yimubai's voice was indifferent. When Yuan ate very slowly and looked up at him very slowly. Then, she said softly, I suddenly don't want to know. He smiled and reached out to stroke her hair. You've become silly, but cute. When Yuan looked at him and forgot to eat. He rubbed her face again. What are you looking at? Eat more. When Yuan didn't know if it was an illusion, but his attitude towards her had changed. However, it wasn't fixed. He was still not very gentle in bed and would sometimes be very rough. However, he took good care of her in daily life. He still had to go on business trips. He would go out for 2 days every 3 to 5 days. His mode of travel was often a helicopter. He flew between all the continents in America. When Yuan was slowly getting used to it, he would often come home in the middle of the night, and when she was asleep, he would wake her up badly, and then he would make love to her, sometimes too eager to remove his clothes, sometimes even all night long. When Yuan felt that this was like the start of a honeymoon. He no longer mentioned having a child, but she had a premonition that she was pregnant, because her waist had been sore recently, her appetite was good, and she was also lazy. That day, he wasn't around. Her period hadn't come for 2 days, so when Yuan went out to buy a pregnancy test kit and tested it in the bathroom. When the 2 red lines slowly appeared, she felt a little complicated. She was pregnant. She gently covered her lips and didn't say anything for a long time. At this time, she really wanted to tell Yimubai that she was pregnant. When Yuan called her, she felt a little uneasy. What happened when she was pregnant with Xiangnan had traumatized her. But this time, the call was quickly picked up. It was his gentle voice. What's wrong, Yuan? Yimubai, where are you? She said very softly. I'm pregnant. Can you come home? When she said this, she felt a little wronged. Because these days, he had been flying around and spending half of his time outside. He wasn't at home even when she was pregnant. Even when he was at home, he spent most of his time in bed. She had a feeling that he clearly didn't have time, but he deliberately came home to spend the night just to spend the night. End of this chapter. Chapter 38-21. Pregnancy 5. After when Yuan said that, the person on the other side seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then, he said in a very soft voice, Is it true? She didn't know if she was acting coquettishly, but Yimubai felt that she was acting coquettishly. His voice became even gentler. I still have something to do. I'll ask Su Mo to accompany you to the hospital first. Xiangnan asked Auntie to check on him for a long time, and he's fine. I'll go to the hospital after I'm done, okay? He had thought it through and made arrangements, but when Yuan refused. I'll go to the hospital myself. Good girl, listen to me. I'm not worried about her driving. He coaxed her a little, then looked at the higher-ups in the conference room and gestured for them to continue the meeting. He cleared his throat and spoke to Wen Yuan again. I'll head over after I'm done. I'm in New York now. Wen Yuan hung up. She couldn't describe her feelings. She wasn't someone who would throw a tantrum, and she wasn't someone who needed to be taken care of. But when he took care of her and arranged everything, she felt like something was missing. Was it because he had become arrogant because he was favored? Su Mo arrived very quickly. She was a short girl, but she was quick in her work. She was methodical and did not have any personal feelings. She was like a working machine. In this aspect, she was very similar to one person, Yi Mulin. When Yuan was quite bored sitting in her car, because he couldn't find a topic to talk about with this little girl, Su Mo drove very carefully. What a joke. Her boss's pregnant wife was sitting in the car. How could she not be careful? The car drove to an expensive private hospital. Miraculously, there was a Chinese gynecologist. It was very convenient to communicate with them, but the price was not cheap. When Yuan did a checkup, and the results showed that she was indeed pregnant, half an hour later, she was sitting on a bench in the corridor of the hospital. Su Mo was talking to Yi Mubai on the phone. She spoke to him in English. When Yuan understood what she was saying, but he was complaining in his heart. Fake foreigner, we are all Chinese, why are you speaking in English? After talking for about 5 minutes, Su Mo hung up the phone and came over to sit with Wen Yuan. Tilting his head, he said, Director Yi said he'll be here soon. He asked us to wait here for a while. After that, she squeezed out a smile on her face, Mrs. Yi, congratulations. Wen Yuan also forced a smile and picked at his fingernails, feeling quite amazed. She thought that Su Mo would not smile. Su Mo felt quite uncomfortable. He reached out and scratched his head again. Actually, it was night director who arranged for me to go. I didn't want to go either. I had no choice. I'm getting paid. Then she laughed, and so did Wen Yuan. She had actually been jealous of this indifferent assistant. Thinking about it, she felt that she was very childish. Yi Mubai was even more childish. After the two of them talked for a while, Yi Mubai came over. His footsteps were fast and hurried, but when he saw Wen Yuan, he slowed down and stood 5 meters away from him. Su Mo stood up and said, I'll be taking my leave then. As she passed Yi Mubai, she said in a low voice, Congratulations. Yi Mubai gave her a gentle look. Su Mo thought to herself that he was finally giving her a good look. Director Yi wasn't a man who was easy to get along with. She had read the previous report that said Best Actor Yi was especially gentle. She secretly felt that her boss and he were two different men, or that he had schizophrenia. Now she knew that the reason he was so cold before was because he wasn't happy and didn't have a woman. End of chapter. Chapter 38-22. Pregnancy 6. What Lin Shui, Lin Danny, none of them were what he wanted. Now that he had gotten what he wanted, it was like a man who had been abstinent for a few years had suddenly started eating meat. Su Mo left, leaving only Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai in the long corridor. His gaze was on her, and she sat there looking at him. She said softly, When I called you, I was a little scared. I was afraid that no one would answer, that you would disappear again. His gaze became a little gentle, and then he slowly walked over and hugged her. No. He gently hugged her shoulders and said in a low voice, No, Wen Yuan. She lay on his shoulder and finally hugged his waist. There was a faint smell of tobacco on his body, as well as the smell of disinfectant from the office. It smelled good when mixed together. She kept hugging him. Yi Mubai smiled. What's wrong? Are you unhappy about being pregnant? She shook her head, and then nodded randomly. I'm happy. She was just a little confused and helpless because of happiness. She hadn't thought about happiness when she married him. She thought that it was just to have a child and cure Xiangnan. He had given her so much, but she was afraid. Yi Mubai, I'm afraid. She closed her eyes. I'm afraid that I'm dreaming, and you won't be here when I wake up. Yi Mubai reached out and gently stroked her hair, comforting her. Pregnant people shouldn't be sentimental, huh? She grunted and still hugged him. Actually, he liked it when she hugged him. She was like a child, different from the usual when Yuan. He liked it too, but he was afraid that she would be immersed in such emotions for too long, so he comforted her and brought her downstairs to sit in the black RV. Along the way, he hugged her and comforted her. When they arrived at the apartment, Yimubai helped her out of the car and went home together. Xiangnan was very happy to know that he would have a little brother and sister. The originally weak little guy made an exception and rolled on the carpet. Yimubai helped Wen Yuan to sit down and poured her a glass of water. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. She smiled comfortably, as if she had finally let go of something that had been weighing on her heart for a long time. So did Yimubai. He was a man after all. Although he was sure of his own abilities, he was still very happy that it was related to Xiangnan's life and death. He sat beside her and called Yi Mulan back in the country. He also forgot about the time difference. Yi Mulan was sleeping when his phone rang. It was Mubai. He sat up quietly and took his phone out. As soon as he closed the door, he whispered, "What's wrong, Mubai?" Yi Mubai held the phone and coughed softly. "Wen Yuan is pregnant. Am I awesome?" "Awesome, right?" Yi Mulan stood at the door of the bedroom with his phone in his hand. He smiled warmly. "That's good. I'll tell Mom and Dad that you shouldn't call them at this late hour." Only then did Yimubai remember that it was nighttime in the country. He smiled and said, "I actually forgot." The two talked for a while before Yi Mulan hung up the phone. When he returned to the bedroom, his little wife was waiting for him. She was lying on the pillow, her hair was messy, and only her eyes were exposed. He looked at her fierce expression and couldn't help but smile. He closed the door softly and deliberately locked it. "What's wrong? You look very much like hubby has a woman outside, don't you?" She supported her chin with one hand and murmured, making a phone call in the middle of the night secretly, "If it's not a woman, then what is it? Is it a wild man?" End of this chapter. Recommend the Urban Guru, Lao Shi Xinshu. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version, M. Chapter 38-23. What nonsense are you talking about? He couldn't help but laugh. He sat over and flipped her over, spanking her a few times. "Stop spouting nonsense. When did I like men?" Bai Shuali was pressed down and spanked a few times. Her voice was trembling. "You're a leader and you're not at home often. I don't know what your hobbies are either. Secretary Li won't tell me either." He snorted softly and hit her a few more times. "You're getting better at talking, aren't you? Secretary Li is now in the same boat as you. She's my secretary, but she's more like your secretary, don't you think so?" "That's not true." She lay down and let him hit her. She would only moan a few times when he hit her fiercely to satisfy a certain man's perverted hobbies. She couldn't be clearer about what kind of person he liked. After messing around for a while, he placed her in his arms and reached out to rub his black hair. He said absent-mindedly, "Mubai called and said that Wen Yuan is pregnant." Bai Shuali sat in his arms and looked up in surprise when she heard that. She played with his chin with her little hand and said very slowly, "Yimubai, do you feel very upset in your heart?" "What do you mean by that?" "Nonsense." He was speechless. He looked at her and seemed to have thought of something. "Oh right, Mubai seems to be the person you've always liked." She yelped and immediately threw herself into his arms. "The person I like now is you." He smiled, reached out to pinch her chin, and bit her lightly. "Then, are you willing to have another child with the person you like now?" She smiled and bit back. I don't want to have a child, but I want to do something to have a child. Yi Mulin raised his eyebrows and turned over to press her down. You've learned to be bad. She hugged his neck and looked at him seductively. Yes, I've learned to be bad. Does Yi Mulin still like me? We'll know after we try. He kissed her slowly and confirmed again. You really don't want to have a child. She held his face and kissed him. We've been separated for so long before we got together. Yi Mulin, you're getting old and not suitable for having a child. Really? He gritted his teeth and said in a sinister voice. Shirley whimpered and obediently lay in his arms, doing whatever she wanted. She bit his shoulder and whispered countless compliments into his ear. At this time, she knew best what he liked to hear. Yimubai's phone call made by Shirley suffer a lot from her husband for the whole night. After that, she was washed clean and put on the bed. Yi Mulin came back from the shower and lay beside her. Looking at her weak appearance, he smiled and reached out to pinch her face. Next time you talk nonsense, I'll do this to you again. Actually, she was all ready. She was waiting for him to sleep. So she closed her eyes and fell asleep with him. It's all because of Xiao Bai. Yi Mulin smiled. Yi I about to marry. She mumbled and moved her face closer to his neck. Then she sighed softly, Yi Mulin, when are we getting married? We have to have a status. I'm sleeping with him every day. She sounded a little aggrieved. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that way. Please remember the domain name of this book. Calm, Wonderful Book House mobile version. Calm. Chapter 38-24. He patted her but gently. Didn't you marry before? Are you going to marry again? Cici and Guze still want to hold a romantic wedding. Yi Mulin, you won't be so stingy, will you? She hugged him and acted coquettishly. Guze bought a really big diamond ring for her. I heard that he wants to kneel down and propose. Her face was full of longing. Yi Mulin was speechless. He pinched his wife's face and said, By Shuali, your husband is poor. Oh, then I'd better save some money. She obediently rested her head on his chest, then stupidly said, As long as you're up, it's fine. He nodded and said, By Shuali, I can't promise that you'll be wasteful every day, but I can promise that you'll be able to have fun every night. His rice worm immediately fell to the ground. What happened to being a serious husband? Of course, she knew that the reason why they couldn't hold a grand wedding was because of his identity. It was already amazing that he could be with her after a divorce. It wasn't good to hold a wedding that would cause a sensation. She didn't really want it from him. Anyway, it was fine as long as it was a small scene. She and Yi Mulin secretly held a small wedding banquet, which was just a family dinner. And Lin Cici and Guze's wedding was indeed grand. Because of Hingtong Group's global economic status, almost all the newspapers around the world published the news of their wedding. Including New York. In the afternoon, Yimubai sat quietly on the sofa reading the newspaper in his luxurious apartment in New York. The sun shone through the curtains and shone on him softly. He stared at the newspaper in his hand and didn't move for a long time. When Yuan woke up after an afternoon nap and went outside to drink a glass of water. When he came out, he saw Yimubai on the sofa. She wanted to call him, but she saw the newspaper in his hand. It was the news of Lin Cici's marriage. He stared at it and was a bit lost in thought. Her heart ached and she slowly walked over to pour herself a glass of water. At this moment, Yimubai noticed her coming out. He closed the newspaper and said with a faint smile, You're awake. He naturally took her into his arms and held the cup for her to drink. Wen Yuan took small sips. After drinking half a cup, he stopped drinking. He put down the cup and reached out to rub her hair. Are you okay? She nodded, then looked at him, trying to find something in his face. His gaze was unfathomable as he smiled faintly. What's wrong? Wen Yuan broke away from him and sat beside him. His voice was very soft. You saw her get married. So. Yimubai gently rubbed her head. You think too much. Wen Yuan put his hand on his abdomen and smiled lightly. Yimubai, I know that she will always have a place in your heart. She also knew that in his heart, she was far more important in bed. She would never be able to get close to his soul. Men were like this. What they couldn't get would always be the moonlight. He might like her a little, but it was just a little, nothing more. It wasn't that Wen Yuan didn't feel a little sad. He didn't mean to hurt her, but her heart was still a little hurt. Every woman hoped that their husband only had her in his heart. When she found out that it wasn't, she couldn't help but feel disappointed, even if she already knew it. After Wen Yuan finished speaking, Yimubai frowned. Wen Yuan, that was a long time ago. She looked up at him. I can understand. Chapter 38-25. Yimubai was even more displeased. He glared at her for a few seconds before replying slowly, You don't need to understand because it won't be a problem between us. Wen Yuan did not say anything. He still coaxed her and pulled her into his embrace, kissing her face. I heard that pregnant women are very emotional. I didn't believe it in the past, but now I do. He kissed her lightly and coaxed her. It's just in the past. And nothing happened between us. All adults knew what it meant to say that nothing had happened. It meant that they hadn't slept together. Wen Yuan understood. Actually, she knew better that it was because he cherished Lin Cece. With Yimubai, there were some things that were not easy to explain. For example, he lusted after Wen Yuan and doted on Lin Cece. Could he say these things to his wife? Of course not. Therefore, he might as well not say it. Some things would be better after a while. Later on, he threw away all the newspapers at home, not letting her see them. He did not read them either, and his heart was at peace. He spent more time at home, but he would also go out to work, but not for too long. He had film companies both in and out of the country. She could tell that he was preparing for his return in the future. She did not ask too much about his work and just stayed at home to take care of the baby. When Wen Yuan was 5 months pregnant, Lin Danny called and said that she was near her house and wanted to meet her. Wen Yuan agreed and let Lin Danny come to the apartment. With the auntie at home, nothing would happen. After not seeing her for half a year, Lin Danny was different from before. She was not as spoiled as before and was more mature. She sat on the sofa and looked at the apartment, smiling. I just wanted to have a chat with you today. Oh right, don't think too much. I'm getting married. She took out an invitation. There's an uncle's son who has been chasing after me for many years. I recently agreed. Wen Yuan picked it up and looked at the photo. He then smiled. You two are quite compatible. Lin Danny just smiled and flipped her hair. It's all right. I didn't know much in the past and always thought that love was greater than the sky. Actually, it's nothing much. It doesn't matter who you spend it with. Only someone who truly loves you. As she spoke, she smiled again. Actually, sometimes, if it's too hard, just let it go. There's nothing bad about that. Lin Danny left after chatting for a while. Of course, Wen Yuan wouldn't go to her wedding, and she didn't ask Yimubai if he would go. When Yimubai came back in the evening, he saw the invitation on the tea table. After taking a shower, he lay down on the bed. Wen Yuan seemed to be asleep, but he knew that she was not. He asked her softly, "Has Lin Danny been here?" "Yes." "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. Then, after a moment's thought, she added, "Are you going?" Yimubai reaches out and rubs her hair. After thinking for a while, he says, "I have a lot of cooperation with Lin Danny's father, so I may have to attend. The wedding is in New York. Wen Yuan, come with me, okay?" She lowered her head. "I don't want to go over. You're my wife, and the baby is stable now. Besides, I don't want others to know that I have a wife." He didn't finish his sentence, but she understood. A good-looking, rich man like him, who was involved in the film and television industry, would have many women throwing themselves at him. Wen Yuan was probably because of this, so she agrees. Just this once. Chapter 38-26. Happy to see Lao Qing. 1-inch, why don't you want to accompany me to socialize? When the child is born, accompany me and take it as a distraction, okay? He was still stroking her hair and his voice was a little hoarse. Wen Yuan looked down. "Yimubai, I don't like that kind of life anymore. I don't like the entertainment industry too much either. I don't want to get close to it." She didn't want to see all the women looking at her husband like that. She was afraid that she would think too much, so she would rather stay away from that circle. Yimubai looked at her quietly for a while. In the end, he didn't say anything and just helped her lie down. "Okay, let's go to sleep." She laid on her side in his arms. Her stomach was already 4 months old and it was already a little big. It was as though there was a layer of skin separating them, but after a while, she felt the changes in his body and his breathing became a little hurried. She rested her face on his shoulder and wanted to move away, but he pressed her head down. His voice was hoarse in the dark. "Don't move." She bit her lip and looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Yimubai turned his body and buried his face in her neck. His breathing was restrained. After a long time, when she thought he would let her go, he grabbed her hand and whispered, "Wen Yuan, we haven't done it for 4 months. Actually, they could do it, but he was always worried that they were different from other couples. Xiangnan couldn't take the risk. So every time he wanted to do it, he would suppress it. This time, he really couldn't take it anymore. Wen Yuan bit her lip and leaned in his arms, letting him do it. Her ears were filled with his suppressed and hoarse voice, showing his extreme joy. She didn't quite understand. Even if he chose to do it, why didn't he do it himself? Of course, as his wife, she couldn't refuse him, so she let him be. After a long time, he finally had enough and hugged her a little tighter. Wen Yuan lay in his arms and heard his rapid heartbeat. She bit her lip and felt a little helpless. After a while, he whispered in her ear, "Are you uncomfortable?" She shook her head. He smiled gently. "Liar." He was about to hit her when Wen Yuan grabbed his hand and whispered, "I'm fine." He hesitated for a moment but decided to let her go. Actually, he knew that she was purposely suppressing herself for Xiangnan. She didn't even dare to enjoy herself like this. At that moment, his feelings were a little complicated, and he also lost interest. So in the few months after she was pregnant, they didn't have sex, not even tonight. If he couldn't hold it in anymore, he would go to the bathroom. Sometimes, when Wen Yuan saw him like this, he would wonder if he would break down from holding it in too much. Most men wouldn't think about it as often as he did. In fact, their relationship had changed ever since Lin Cece got married, although they didn't say it out loud. On the day of Lin Danny's wedding, Wen Yuan and Yimubai went together. Because she was pregnant, she had chosen a V-neck, ash-gray dress. The hem of the dress was spread out to cover her slightly bulging belly and accentuate her slender waist. Her long hair was casually tied up, which made her seem more gentle. Her shoes were soft and mid-heeled, and she held a white sheepskin handbag in her hand. She looked especially good, which probably had something to do with Wen Yuan's family background. Even though she didn't socialize much, she was very good at picking out clothes, and she definitely wasn't stingy enough to bring them out. End of this chapter. Chapter 38-27. When she came out of the bedroom, Yimubai was stunned. Perhaps it was because he hadn't seen her at home for half a year that he wasn't used to it. He stared at her for a long time, but Wen Yuan misunderstood and said calmly, "Cosmetics are for pregnant women. There won't be a problem." He smiled and held her hand. "I'm just a little surprised, Wen Yuan." As he said that, he leaned forward and kissed her. Wen Yuan was stunned. He had already held her hand and walked out. Xiangnan wanted to pounce on him, but his parents had already left. Xiangnan said in a daze, "Mummy is so beautiful." Sigh, there was no place for him in the world of the two of them. Wen Yuan followed Yimubai downstairs. He drove a black Phantom and Wen Yuan sat in the back seat. Yimubai sat in the car and said calmly, "There's a cup in front with warm water in it. Drink some when you're thirsty. Don't drink any beverages or alcohol when you go to the reception later, understand?" His tone was a little domineering, which was rare. Wen Yuan nodded. "I know." Yimubai drove on the streets of New York and looked at the rearview mirror from time to time. Then, he smiled. "Wen Yuan, are you going to attend the wedding with a stepmother's face? Think about what the reporters will write. They will probably dig up the things between me and Lin Danny again." Wen Yuan bit his lips. "That has nothing to do with me. You're my wife. How is that not related?" He chuckled. "Be happy." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. Of course, she wouldn't put on an expression. However, she didn't want to pretend to be happy on purpose. That would be very fake. As for Yimubai, he just needed her to be normal. Tonight, a lot of celebrities attended, and it was the first time that Yimubai had brought his wife to socialize, so there were as many cameras on them as there were couples, especially Yimubai and Lin Danny. Fortunately, there was no news about Lin Danny's suicide abroad, so they didn't pay much attention to it. However, Wen Yuan's oriental temperament was very charming, so the foreigners kept clicking the shutter, thinking that she was the Oriental Hepburn. Yimubai took care of her emotions, afraid that she wouldn't be used to it. In fact, how could a girl from the Wen family not be used to it? Besides, she had been Yimubai's nominal wife for a few years, so she had long been used to these occasions. In the banquet hall, she and Yimubai gave the gifts together and chatted for a while. Then he helped her sit down on the sofa. From time to time, people would come over to chat with them. Later, Yimubai needed to talk to a new project. It was not convenient here, so Wen Yuan politely asked him to talk to someone else, saying that she could do it alone. Yimubai and a few of the producers went to another corner to chat. Wen Yuan leaned against the wall and read a magazine for a while, eating some snacks. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was very good. It was said that a world-class violinist had been invited, and it was because both parties had a personal relationship. Wen Yuan listened and was dazed for a moment. Then she turned her head and saw a familiar face. She slowly stood up and looked at the young man who was playing the violinist. "Kong Chiao." She murmured his name. The man in front of her smiled, finished playing a song, and put down the strings in his hand. "Long time no see, Wen Yuan." Kong Chiao reached out to her, and Wen Yuan hesitantly put her hand in his. She thought it would be a handshake, but Kong Chiao gently pulled her into his arms and kissed her on the cheek. Are you all right? He just kissed her face. It was normal abroad. Although Wen Yuan was a little uncomfortable, she didn't make a fuss. She stood up straight and pursed her lips. I'm fine. Why are you here? I'm just that personal friendship. He smiled. I can't help it. As he said that, he put down the violinist and took a glass of red wine for her. He also took a glass for himself. Let's drink to our reunion. Wen Yuan wanted to refuse, but the glass in her hand was taken by a strong hand. Then, it was Yi Mubai's indifferent voice. Mr. Kong, my wife is pregnant and can't drink. Sorry. Chapter 38-28. Wen Yuan's body stiffened, and then he slowly looked at Yi Mubai. With an inscrutable expression on his face, he naturally put one hand around her waist, looked at Kong Chiao with a smile, and said to Wen Yuan, Don't you want to introduce him? Wen Yuan came back to his senses and forced a smile. My university tutor's son, Kong Chiao, is also a famous violinist. She paused for a moment. Kong Chiao, my husband, Yi Mubai. Kong Chiao's eyes fell on her face, and after a while, he said, I heard from my mother that you are married. With that, he reached out to Yi Mubai. Mr. Yi, I've heard about you for a long time. Yi Mubai also reached out to shake his hand. Mr. Kong, I've heard about you and your mother from Wen Yuan. Kong Chiao smiled and looked at Wen Yuan. Really? Wen Yuan was a little uncomfortable. When did she mention it to Yi Mubai? He was just talking nonsense. But Yi Mubai was very relaxed. He held the glass of red wine and clinked it with Kong Chiao. Mr. Kong, are you in New York recently? Kong Chiao's eyes fell on Wen Yuan's face. Just for a week, and then I'll go to Europe. He still had something to do, so he didn't chat with them for too long. Wen Yuan, contact me when you return to China. My mother misses you very much. Wen Yuan nodded. I will. Kong Chiao's eyes fell on her face, and then moved to her lower abdomen. Finally, he said hoarsely, I haven't congratulated you yet. It was probably because the regret in his eyes was too obvious, and the way he looked at her was not like a senior brother looking at a junior sister, but purely like a man looking at a woman. Wen Yuan couldn't ignore it, and of course, Yi Mubai could see it even more clearly. This man had such thoughts about his wife. Wen Yuan also felt uncomfortable. He reached out and touched his hair. Thank you. Their eyes met and stared at each other for a few seconds. Kong Chiao left, and after a while, Alice was played, when Yuan looked up and met Yi Mubai's gaze. There was a hint of contemplation in his eyes. He drank the red wine in his glass and asked casually, were you on good terms with him before? Wen Yuan was still a little uncomfortable. He pursed his lips and said, because of his mother, I'm asking about your relationship. Wen Yuan, have you ever liked him? Yi Mubai asked very straightforwardly. He didn't care about the occasion. He just looked around and asked directly. There was a reason why he asked this question. Kong Chiao was handsome and famous all over the world. He must have attracted a lot of girls when he was young. Wen Yuan seemed to like this type of guy. He, Yi Mubai, reeked of money. Would she still like him? Wen Yuan frowned at his direct question, but still answered, no. Then, did he like you? He asked immediately. This time, Wen Yuan didn't answer him immediately. He sat down and ate for a while before saying, no. Liar. He looked at her condescendingly. His eyes were a little deep. Wen Yuan looked up and met his unfathomable eyes. For a long time, they didn't speak, and the atmosphere was very subtle. There was a slap, and there was Konkola's Alice. Yimubai suddenly leaned forward and whispered in her ear, "Kong Chiao played it for you to hear, didn't he?" She wanted to deny it, but Yimubai's finger gently touched her lips. "I don't believe you haven't heard it." Chapter 38-29. The scene of Kong Ji looking at his wife lovingly while Wen Yuan was playing the piano appeared in his mind. Just thinking about it made him feel uncomfortable. Wen Yuan frowned again. "Yimubai, you really think too much. You know very well whether I think too much or not, okay?" He pressed his finger on her lips, hinting at her. Later, he went to socialize again, but as soon as Wen Yuan looked up, she could see him looking at her thoughtfully, as if he was catching her in the act. Wen Yuan felt a little annoyed. Later, Kong Chao didn't come to talk to her again, probably because he noticed something. It wasn't until the wedding buffet was over and Wen Yuan and Yimubai left that Kong Chao came over and handed her a business card. "Call me if you need anything in the future." Wen Yuan nodded. "Okay, senior brother. I will." Kong Chao's eyes were still on her face. After a while, he smiled. "Okay, let's go back. It's getting late." However, his own gaze was still on her face. As a man, Yimubai could see the strong reluctance in his heart. His heart was sour as he held onto Wen Yuan's waist and smiled. "Wen Yuan, we should go. You're pregnant, you should rest more." Wen Yuan knew that he did it on purpose, but he had no choice but to smile at Kong Chiao and leave with him. Yimubai drank. The driver drove the car, and he sat in the back seat with Wen Yuan. Sitting in the back seat, Kong Chiao's voice was very light. "Did you have a good time tonight?" Wen Yuan was a little tired. He leaned against the seat, squinted his eyes, and said in a lazy voice, "What do you mean?" Yimubai leaned over, and his nose was filled with a faint smell of alcohol. The mellow fragrance mixed with the man's breath was very tempting. He stared at her face and didn't say anything. He just reached out and rubbed her earlobe. "You should take a rest first." Wen Yuan thought that the matter was over. She was really tired, so she closed her eyes slightly. She didn't wake up until the car stopped in front of the apartment. The driver was already gone, and there were only the two of them. She yawned. "We're here." Just as she was about to get out of the car, Yimubai helped her put on his jacket and said softly, "You look distracted." Strangely, she found a trace of jealousy in his words. She asked softly, "Yimubai, are you jealous?" "No." He held her with one arm and took her bag with the other, leading her into the elevator. She still wanted to say something, but he had already leaned over and kissed her hard and hurried, hurting her lips. "Yimu. Bye." Her voice was intermittent. She clenched her fists and tried to push him away, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move him away. He kept trapping her, not letting her move an inch. His kiss was also completely invading her. His breath touched her, and with every breath they took, it seeped into her limbs. She had no strength to resist, and her legs were so weak that her body slid down. Yimubai held her waist with one hand and kissed her even more deeply. Wen Yuan didn't know what was wrong with him, but she vaguely felt that it had something to do with Kong Chiao. She tried to explain, but her voice was muffled. He stopped and stared at her with a burning gaze. Then, he kissed her again under her gaze. Wen Yuan was helpless and could only let him kiss her. She wanted to say that their elevator had been stopped for a long time, and it was opening and closing. At this time, their auntie came out. She stood at the door and saw them kissing in the elevator. The auntie was stunned for a moment and wanted to avoid it, but Yimubai noticed her presence. Chapter 38:30. They had stopped kissing, but the atmosphere was quite subtle. The auntie cleared her throat uncomfortably. I'm going to take out the trash. Yimubai nodded and walked out of the elevator with Wen Yuan. The elderly auntie almost jumped into the elevator. Oh yeah, I'll go back later. I won't be coming back. As for the trash can, she would take it home. The elevator door closed. Wen Yuan flicked her hair and lowered her head, not saying a word. Yimubai swiped the door and turned sideways. Let's go home. She looked up at him and felt that his gaze was a bit unfathomable. He followed her in as soon as she entered, and then he caught her hand. She called his name. Yimubai. He carried her and walked towards the master bedroom. Wen Yuan was nervous. She had a vague premonition of what he wanted to do. Her fingers tugged at the clothes on his shoulders. I'm pregnant. He didn't hear it. There was a touch of indifference on his handsome face. She hadn't seen him like this for a long time. She was a little afraid that he would hurt the child. This wasn't just a child, but also Xiangnan's life. She felt that no matter how irrational he was, he shouldn't joke about Xiangnan. So when he put her on the soft bed, she felt uneasy. There's nothing between me and Kong Chiao. Don't think too much. He bent his knees on both sides of her and touched her red lips with his fingers. He smiled. I didn't mention him. Why do you look like you're guilty? I didn't. She turned her face away because his gaze was too aggressive. She didn't want to talk to him anymore. At this time, he didn't want to talk to her either. He just wanted to have her and prove that she was his. She was pregnant. No matter how rough he was, he still retained a bit of gentleness. However, the whole process was really not something a pregnant woman could bear. Moreover, they hadn't done it for a few months. Wen Yuan couldn't take it anymore. Later, he only let her go after she cried so hard. However, it was already very late at night. Yimubai let out a sigh of relief. After being fierce, his body felt comfortable, but he also felt a little regretful. Wen Yuan was quite miserable. She lay there for a long time without moving, just lightly panting. Yimubai kissed her eyebrows and asked in a low voice, Are you okay? Another tear slid down the corner of Wen Yuan's eye. She didn't want to talk to him. Yimubai also knew that he was a bit harsh just now. His voice was slightly hoarse. All right, I'm not angry anymore. Did I make you uncomfortable? Yimubai, you bastard. She was so angry that she slowly turned her back to him. He laughed lowly and hugged her from behind. Are you angry? He knew that she had feelings for him, but tonight, he was mainly relying on his feelings. It was impossible for her to enjoy it. She probably hated him to the core, right? Hugging her, his fingers slowly moved down to gently rub her stomach. Then, he asked in a low and hoarse voice, Tell me, did he confess to you? Wen Yuan knew who he was talking about. She was silent for a moment. No, really. I believe you, he said generously. Then he murmured, but he likes you. Wen Yuan, I don't believe that you can't sense it. As he spoke, he gently bit her earlobe. He was a little unwilling, but there was also an indescribable feeling in his heart. Wen Yuan didn't answer his question. He was right. She could feel it. She knew it when she was young. However, at that time, Kong Chiao wanted to go abroad. He never said anything, so she pretended not to know. Later on, she was infatuated with Yimubai. Kong Chiao seemed to have disappeared from her life. However, at this moment, when she thought back to the past, it was actually very beautiful. Chapter 38-31. She didn't say anything, which aroused his dissatisfaction. He bit her again. What are you thinking about? When Yuan's fingers gently stroked the pillow, she suddenly had a wicked idea. She smiled. I was thinking that if Kong Qiao had told me at that time, and I had promised him, would it have been, as soon as she finished speaking, her body was pulled over by him. He pinned her on the pillow. It was a little overbearing, but he didn't forget to be gentle to her. He carefully avoided her stomach. Wen Yuan. His expression was a little scary, which she had never seen before. For a moment, she looked at him and didn't say anything for a long time. He continued, "You're not allowed to see him in the future." She closed her eyes. "He is my teacher's son. Yimubai, don't think too much about it. I won't go out of my way to meet him, but I won't avoid him either. That would be too problematic." Yimubai looked at her quietly. He originally wanted to force her, but when he saw Wen Yuan like this, he gave up. She had never been a weak woman, as he had thought. She was resolute and crafty, and his attraction had come too suddenly. He turned to the side and lay quietly for a while. Then he said, "I'll take you to the shower." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. He carried her to the shower and carried her back to the bed in the bedroom to help her wipe. His breathing became chaotic again. After all, he was a man who hadn't had sex for several months. Wen Yuan's eyes opened a slit and looked at him. Then he said in a low voice, "Just now, you wanted enough. Now, even if you want more, I don't have the strength to accompany you." She almost sighed and said, "Yimubai, I want to sleep for a while." Yimubai looked at her condescendingly. He put down his hand that was originally on her shoulder, which meant that he was letting her go. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "You sleep." Wen Yuan fell asleep quickly, but he didn't feel sleepy. He went outside to smoke a cigarette. He wanted to see Xiangnan, but his eyes bumped into her bag. He went over to sit on the sofa and took out a business card from her bag. It was given to her by Kong Qiao. Yimubai stared at it for a long time. Finally, he took a lighter and burned it. Flirting in front of him, after the fever was over, he felt refreshed and went back to his room to sleep. Wen Yuan had slept with him fiercely at night, and she was pregnant for several months, so she woke up late. When she woke up, it was already past 10 o'clock. She opened her eyes and sat up. She heard Xiangnan and Yimubai talking outside. "He's still at home." Wen Yuan lowered her face and placed her hand on her abdomen. Her abdomen moved slightly. She could feel the child moving. Perhaps he was a little impatient after being tormented by his father last night. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. Thinking back to last night, he seemed to be so angry that he acted like this. Or maybe he couldn't hold it in anymore. Wen Yuan got up to brush her teeth and wash her face before going out. Yimubai was reading a book with Xiangnan in his arms. When he saw her coming out, he put Xiangnan down and naturally prepared breakfast for her. Wen Yuan sat down and ate breakfast in silence. Yimubai stared at her. Finally, she couldn't stand his gaze and looked up. "Why are you looking at me like that?" He coughed softly. "Are you okay now?" Wen Yuan's face heated up. She then said in a low voice, "You didn't ask last night. Don't you think it's too late to ask now?" He said in a low voice, "Then I'll ask you the next time I do it. Tomorrow, which is Friday, will be updated at noon. 15 chapters. This is not the most explosive chapter, the most explosive chapter is yet to come." Chapter 38-32. When Yuan ignored him and continued to eat his breakfast, in the afternoon, Imubai went to the company in New York. When Yuan went to look through Kong Chiao's business card, she and Kong Chiao used to have a good relationship. She wanted to save his phone number, but she couldn't find it in her bag. She was a little puzzled. She had clearly put it in her bag. Later, she saw Yimubai's cigarettes and the lighter on the coffee table. She took a look at the trash can and there were obvious ashes in it. She was furious. He didn't even cover up what he did. When Yuan was a little angry, he stared at it for a long time but didn't say anything in the end. Yimubai came home very late. When he got home, when Yuan and Xiangnan were already asleep, he entered the bedroom quietly and went straight to the bathroom without turning on the light. When he came back and lay on the bed, he reached out and touched Wen Yuan. "Are you asleep?" She didn't move. He smiled. "I know you're not asleep." Wen Yuan was angry with him but didn't say anything. He didn't care if he could ignore him. He leaned against the headboard and pinched her face. "I know you're not asleep. Are you angry?" When Yuan couldn't help but slap his hand away. "Yimubai, you know why I'm angry. Because I burned Kong Chiao's business card," he said coldly and indifferently. When Yuan was furious. "Yimubai, in your heart, I'm just an accessory, a tool for you to give birth to a child, am I right?" He retracted his fingers that were stroking her hair and said indifferently, "Do you think I'll be willing to let you hang out with someone who admires you?" When Yuan sat down, sensing that he was about to lie down and sleep, she pursed her lips and said in a soft voice, "You and Lin Danny are far more than just love. Didn't you go to her wedding and the award ceremony as well?" "Did I say anything?" Lu Yanchen was speechless. "You and Lin Danny are way more than just love." Yimubai opened his eyes. "When Yuan, are you going to bring up the past with me?" "No, I just want to say that we are equal. I don't want my normal contact to be restricted by you," When Yuan said calmly. After saying that, he sat up again and frowned. "Lin Danny and I are needed for work. Kong Chiao, is it? Is it necessary to keep in touch?" When Yuan raised her head and stared at him, there was something in her eyes that he couldn't understand. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "Yimubai, I realize that I can't talk to you clearly. He likes you." That was what he minded. When Yuan chuckled. "Lin Danny doesn't like you. You've even hugged and kissed. Yimubai, you're a double standard now." He turned on the light, stared at her, and said word by word, "You don't want to see Kong Chiao, I don't want to see Lin Danny either. These are two different things." When Yuan felt a little tired and looked down. "Yimubai, you're still not getting to the point. There's nothing going on between me and Kong Chiao. We're just old friends. Why can't we keep in touch?" His breath caught in his throat and he asked her softly, "Do you want to be in contact with him?" When Yuan stared at his expression and said very slowly, "I can't talk to you." She didn't want to argue with him, so she lifted the covers and got up. "I'll sleep in the guest room." Just as he stood up, his wrist was caught by a hand. "You sleep here. I'll sleep in the guest room," he whispered and brought her back. However, he didn't put her under the covers but held her in his arms. Chapter 38-33. When Yuan struggled. "Yimubai, what are you doing?" He wasn't cold when he hugged her, but they were in a cold war. What was he doing now? Yimubai hugged her and placed her in his arms. He lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "I'm jealous." When Yuan didn't say anything. She just leaned in his arms and bit his shoulder gently. She had an indescribable grievance in her heart, but she couldn't say it out loud. From the start to the end, she only liked him. And she knew that there were countless women by his side in the past, but now, because of Kong Chiao's business card, they had fallen out like this. She was a little sad. The unfairness between them could only mean one thing. He didn't see her as an equal. He said that he was jealous. Wasn't she angry? When Yuan didn't say anything. After he kissed her, he didn't go to the guest room and hugged her to sleep. The matter with Kong Chiao was left unsettled. After all, life still had to go on. But then, when Yuan bumped into Kong Chiao in the hospital. He came to the hospital to visit someone he knew as a farewell. When Yuan happened to bump into him during her prenatal checkup. Moreover, Yimubai had something to do today, so Su Mo accompanied her. Kong Chiao was surprised to bump into him on the stairs. Then, she smiled lightly. We meet again. When Yuan smiled too. What a coincidence. Su Mo looked at them and pointed to the front. You guys chat. I'll talk to the doctor first. When Yuan nodded. After Su Mo walked far away, she sat on the bench with Kong Chiao. You're leaving New York. He nodded. Yes, I'm leaving. Didn't Sir accompany you to the prenatal checkup? When Yuan was stunned. Oh, he had something to do today. Then, there was silence. When Yuan then found a topic. How is teacher? He had a heart operation the year before last. He's doing well now. Kong Chiao sighed. So I'll probably come back to develop my career in the next 2 years. My mother needs someone to take care of her. When Yuan nodded. Yes. Kong Chiao hesitated for a moment. Does he treat you well? When Yuan was stunned for a moment before he smiled. Not bad. Kong Chiao stared at her eyes. There was a faint flame, but he restrained himself, not revealing it, nor would he give her pressure. After all, she was already a wife. Kong Chiao coughed lightly. Oh right, let's have a meal later. When Yuan couldn't refuse because Kong Chiao's mother treated her very, very well. She often practiced the piano at the Kong residence and was very familiar with Kong Chiao. She thought that if it weren't for the fact that she was infatuated with Yimubai, the person she would eventually marry would most likely be Kong Chiao. She looked down. All right. Your phone, he suddenly said. When Yuan looked at him in surprise. He smiled again. My phone. I'll save my number. She was a little touched that he didn't expose her. She gave him the phone and he dialed his number to save it for her. When he put away the phone, he asked in a low voice, It won't be hard for you to have dinner with me, right? He was afraid that Yimubai would make things difficult for her. In Kong Chiao's heart, he liked Wen Yuan, but he could only give his blessings for her marriage. He could only hide everything else in his heart. Wen Yuan shook his head. No. She smiled at him. I'm not such a useless person. Kong Chiao's eyes were stained with some pain. He didn't know what to say. Chapter 38-34. She was right. She was not a useless girl. She had her principles. He had always thought that when she grew up and became famous, she would be waiting for him there. But when he turned around, she fell in love with someone else. At that time, when he returned to China, they sat under a tree and drank beer. She told him that she had never seen a man as handsome as Yimubai and that she wanted to pursue him. At that time, he felt bitter. He wanted to tell her that he liked her, but he saw the little stars in her eyes. It was a Wen Yuan that he had never seen before. For love, regardless of anything. Later on, she married Yi Mulin. When they met again, her wish came true. She stood beside Yi Mubai and became Mrs. Yi. When Yuan had never been someone who could be bullied easily. She was just good at enduring silently. She was a young lady with a contradictory personality, but he liked this kind of personality. Kong Chao smiled and couldn't help putting his hand in the air. It seemed that he wanted to stroke her hair or touch her face. But his hand stayed in the air for a long time. Finally, his voice was a little hoarse. I'll go to the restaurant opposite first. Come back after the checkup. I'll wait for you. When Yuan nodded. At the other end of the aisle, Su Mo held her breath. In fact, she could see that Kong Chao liked Wen Yuan very much. His eyes were very gentle. She had a feeling that Wen Yuan would be happier with Kong Chao than with her boss. But she couldn't help it. Su Mo thought to herself that she would never tell her boss what happened today. But it didn't mean that Yi Mubai didn't know. Su Mo accompanied Wen Yuan to the checkup. The baby was all right. Wen Yuan looked at Su Mo and didn't hide it. I asked Kong Chao to have dinner together. Come with us. Of course, Su Mo refused. You guys go ahead. I'll eat alone. I'll wait for you in the car. Then she blinked. I won't tell Director Yi. Don't worry. Wen Yuan smiled. He's just an old friend. Su Mo also smiled. But in her heart, she thought, but Director Yi will be angry and jealous. Don't think that I can't see it. The atmosphere was subtle. Su Mo waved her hand and ran away. After a while, she came back. I'll send you there. Mr. Kong, please send it back. She was always worried. As the special assistant, she felt that this baby was particularly important to the night couple. Wen Yuan didn't refuse. He let Su Mo accompany him to the restaurant that Kong Chao had booked. The place was pretty good. Kong Chao also invited Su Mo to eat together, but Su Mo refused. After Su Mo left, Kong Chao smiled. This little assistant is quite interesting. Wen Yuan flipped his hair and looked at him. Do you want me to introduce her to you? She's quite nice. She's 28 years old and suits you well. After she finished speaking, Kong Chao remained silent for a long time. After a long while, Kong Chao poured her a cup of warm water. Then he said in a low voice, "Why did you change your career to be a matchmaker? Do I look like I'm lacking a girlfriend?" Wen Yuan was a little embarrassed. He smiled faintly and said, "That's true, you don't lack girlfriends." While Kong Chao was ordering, he didn't ask her what she liked to eat, because he clearly knew what she liked to eat. While ordering, he looked up and smiled at her. "But I don't have a girlfriend right now." Wen Yuan was a little speechless. "Kong Chao, you're having a bad taste now." Chapter 38-35. Crazy Jealous 8. He closed the menu and handed it to the waiter. "I'm just not interested in the girl just now. Is it wrong to refuse?" Wen Yuan drank some water and held the glass. "But my teacher will want you to get married soon." He was 2 years older than her and was now 35 years old. It was indeed the age to get married. Kong Chao looked at her and said softly, "Wen Yuan, my mother will want me to find a girl I really like. Otherwise, marriage is just a formality. What's the point of it?" Wen Yuan drank some water again to hide herself. Kong Chao laughed at her. Then he took out a box and pushed it in front of her. Wen Yuan looked at him. "Why did you give me a present for no reason?" "How can it be for no reason? I made up for your marriage." Kong Qiao smiled. Open it. Wen Yuan looked at him and then opened it slowly. The thing inside was dazzling. Wen Yuan's eyes were a little warm and her heart was slightly aching. It was a piano made of crystal. How much time and effort did he spend to find such a thing? He couldn't have bought it at the last minute. He must have prepared it for a long time. Kong Qiao stared at her eyes and said slowly, "My mother said that you are the most talented student she has ever taught. She suggested you to study abroad but you refused. I know you did it for Yimubai, but Wen Yuan, in my heart, you will always be the same Wen Yuan. You are not willing to be ordinary. You said that you want to perform on the best stage in the world. Have you forgotten?" "I haven't forgotten." Wen Yuan's eyes were wet. She was stunned for a long time before she looked up. "Kong Qiao, I just lost myself. Until now. I'm still lost." He understood her and still smiled. "It's okay. As long as you are happy, Wen Yuan. I mean, if one day you feel that you are not so happy, come back and play the piano. The way you play the piano." He rubbed his chin with his fingers. "It's pretty." Wen Yuan's eyes were filled with tears. She smiled. "I know." Kong Qiao was still the person who understood her after she had experienced so much. He was always by her side and always appeared warmly. Wen Yuan separated from him. She said that she would return to China after the baby was born and visit her teacher. She said that she would definitely be there when Kong Qiao got married. "Oh, I'll tell you when I find a girlfriend." He walked her to the parking lot. Along the way, the two of them chatted casually. He said that he didn't want to look for a mediocre person, and when Yuan said that Su Mo wasn't a mediocre person. She had seen him before. That moment was like returning to the past. It was especially beautiful. Kong Qiao walked her to the car and watched the car drive away. He stood where he was for a long time, then took out a cigarette and smoked. He seldom smoked, but at this moment his heart was bitter. The girl he had liked for more than 10 years was getting married and having a child. He was always disappointed. In the car, when Yuan gently caressed the box, feeling a bit complicated. Kong Qiao's words to her kept ringing in her ears. She also admitted that she gave up her dreams for a man, and she became not quite like herself. This kind of life, was it really what she wanted? This kind of man was not what she had imagined before. When Yuan suddenly realized that her life was actually a mess. Other than Yimubai, she actually had nothing. She raised her head, a teardrop at the corner of her eye. Su Mo was a little shocked when she saw this from the side. She said in a low voice, "Don't let the night guide see you like this, otherwise he might not be happy." End of chapter. Chapter 38-36. Promise me you'll never see him again. When Yuan looked up at Su Mo and smiled. "Thank you." To her, Concho was a witness to her past dreams, which was wonderful. Su Mo could understand. She was very grateful. Su Mo shook her hand and smiled. "Wen Yuan, can I call you Wen Yuan?" Wen Yuan nodded. Su Mo said, "In the past, I wanted to be a writer, but in the end, I only became a small assistant, and Ping Xiong's assistant at that." Wen Yuan was surprised. Su Mo coughed lightly. "My ears are very sharp." Then, they looked at each other and smiled. Wen Yuan's sadness disappeared without a trace. When they arrived at the apartment, Su Mo left first. The housekeeper said that Xiangnan was taking an afternoon nap and asked if Wen Yuan had eaten. "I ate outside." Wen Yuan said softly, and then she went back to her bedroom. She took out the box and carefully found a place to put it. She threw the box away because she was afraid that Yumubai would see it. She had been looking at it the whole afternoon. She suddenly felt a little happy in her heart, as if she had found a little bit of her past, and even felt a little free. Yumubai came home a little early. The auntie left during dinner. Yumubai didn't say anything at first. It wasn't until Xiangnan went to bed that he walked into the bedroom. When Yuan had finished showering and was wearing a bathrobe, his belly was bulging. She sits on the sofa and blow-dries her hair. Yumubai reaches for a towel and says, "I'll help you dry it. It'll be dry after a while. It's not good to use too much of a pregnant hairdryer." When Yuan nodded and leaned back on the sofa, letting him take care of her. She didn't ask him what he did when he was out for a day, because she couldn't help and didn't like to meddle in a man's business. Yumubai, on the other hand, asked about her prenatal checkup and how the baby was. When Yuan leaned back comfortably with his eyes half closed. "The child is fine. The ultrasound report is in the bag. Take a look at it yourself." He didn't say anything. He just dried her hair and carried her to the bed. When Yuan thought he was going to look at the prenatal checkup report, but he didn't leave for a long time. When Yuan opened his eyes. "What's wrong?" Yimubai's fingers gently stroke her face, and his voice is a little hoarse. "When Yuan, am I not good enough to you?" She shook her head, closed her eyes, and smiled. "Why do you ask?" He was very close to her, and the tip of his nose moved over to smell the fragrance of her body. After a while, his voice became even more hoarse. "Do you like your current life?" She opened her eyes and looked straight into his. His eyes were fixed on her, and he had no intention of moving away. Therefore, when Yuan knew that he had something to say to her, or he knew something. However, what she couldn't understand was that he had been very calm since he came back. She chuckled softly. "You're quite patient." The tip of his nose gently touched hers. "When Yuan, if I don't ask, you won't tell me, right?" "Say what?" She didn't avoid his gaze and smiled lightly. "Do you think there's anything else I need to say to you?" Her smile was a little self-deprecating. "Don't I even have the freedom to have a meal with a familiar friend? I remember we discussed this." He murmured, and his hand gently held her chin. "Don't you remember?" When Yuan's fingers clenched into a fist, and she said patiently, "I didn't agree to anything. I also said that Kong Chiao is just a friend. There was nothing between me and him in the past, and there won't be anything between me and him in the future. Isn't that enough for Yumubai? Do you want me to avoid my mentor's son?" End of this chapter. Chapter 38-37. I promise not to see him again. I promise not to see him again. He stared at her, not letting go of any changes in her expression. "When Yuan, I mind." When Yuan looked at him for a long time before looking away. "Are you following me?" He didn't deny it. "Su Mo will be fine if you don't see him." When Yuan was a little shocked. She turned to look at him, unable to believe what she had just heard. If she didn't see him, then what would happen to Su Mo? Under her gaze, Yumubai said calmly, "Su Mo won't be able to find a job in the industry. When Yuan's annual salary is about $100,000, and her family's annual expenses are about $600,000 to $700,000. I forgot to tell you that she has a sick brother, and she needs to spend a lot of money." When Yuan looked at him with eyes that seemed to be quenched by ice. She had never thought that Yumubai was such a heartless man. She remembered that when she was infatuated with him, he was gentle to everyone. Even though he was heartless to her later on, he was still gentle to others. I don't believe it, she spat out. Yimubai smiled faintly. When Yuan, you don't really understand men. In other words, men are male animals, and they are very protective of their territory. When Yuan looked at him and said softly, is it because you don't have confidence, or because you don't think that you're good enough to make me fall head over heels for you? Yimubai, it's because you don't intend to give up everything, so you're using this method, right? If he had given his heart and given up everything, he wouldn't have needed to use this method to keep her. She could tell that he didn't want her to work or interact with other men. The only time she could go out was with him. It was as though she was going to be turned into an accessory by him. And yet, he seemed to be asking her to agree and be willing. She found it ridiculous. She looked at him as though he was a stranger and said softly, Yimubai, did you do this when you liked Lin Cece? Did you ask her to not see anyone else, not even Guzé? She finally couldn't help but say what was in her heart, or is it because you lost to Guzé that you have a shadow in your heart that you would use such a method to lock up a woman? Yimubai's expression turned ugly. He stared at her for a long time without saying anything. When Yuan laughed self-deprecatingly. I overestimated myself. She thought too much. She thought those desires were true love. His liking was just liking, and it was far from love. From the past till now, he had only loved Lin Cece. But now, when Yuan realized to his horror that Lin Cece was the only one he loved, Yimubai stood up and said faintly, when Yuan, you're thinking too much. No husband would want his wife to meet someone else in private and have an affair with someone else. When Yuan stared at him for a long time before he walked to the door. She stopped him, Yimubai. He paused at the door. Have you thought it through?